Today we're talking about the war on drugs and how that affects food insecurity and other downstream effects from the war on drugs. Because in December and around the holidays, lots and lots of folks are giving to food pantries. We're talking more about hunger and food deserts and grocery supplies and just the economy. So it's a really great month to talk about this and raise awareness. I have some folks that I adore on this panel and one more joining. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves and then we'll do a brief history before we jump into conversation. Feel free to add your comments and questions to the stream. We are happy to answer them. Great. And so I'll let everyone begin by introducing themselves. But thank you again. And this is sponsored by Curaleaf's Rooted in Good program.
I'll start. Hi, everyone. I am a neighbor, basically, to make sure that everyone in my neighborhood. And so I have done a lot of mutual aid, helping to support things like and neighborhood resources. We all deserve to live in places where we've got deeply connected. Thank you.
All right. And I guess that kind of puts it on me. Happy to be here. Thank you, Rebecca, for having me. I am Simona Wright James, and I serve as the engagement director for Marijuana Matters. And some of you may already be familiar with us, but we are a social enterprise that just believes very deeply that when it comes to the cannabis ecosystem, that equity should be at the center of that. And so a topic like this is super exciting. So exciting that, again, I was probably like an hour before just ready for the conversation because it's such a good marriage of topics, because we don't often enough put these kind of social issues along the same wavelength. So definitely excited to be here. My background is actually healthcare and mental health before joining cannabis. So I'm excited.
So perfect. So I'm going to go through just a little bit of history, just for context, because I feel like, we kind of have the basics of, a lot of people kind of know, like, oh, there was prohibition, but like, why? The point I always make when we're teaching patients is there was no scientific reason at all for prohibition. It was all based on, classism, racism, and essentially capitalism. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. And feel free to join in at any point. Everyone on the panel to, chime in if you have anything to add, because I know this is the briefest history of everything messed up in about 3,000 years in about 5 to 7 minutes. So brief history of just cannabis. Cannabis is used from 2500 BCE as a medicine, spiritual tool for textiles, ropes, sails. 1300s to 1600s, Catholic Church starts executing women for cannabis. 1690, Virginia passes a law that every farmer must grow hemp and it could be used as currency. From 1690 forward until Prohibition, hemp is actually one of the biggest exports. This is what gets a little bit of attention and part of the reason why cannabis ends up becoming illegal. William Randolph Hearst owned paper, and Andrew Mellon had a pretty large stake in DuPont Chemicals. So they had a reason to, use racism and classism to, stroke fear and create prohibition. In the 1800s, cannabis is very fashionable recreationally here in Paris. In 1880 to 1930, we have peak medical use. They used cannabis for asthma, dysentery, pain. 1940s, this slide is the positive things we see in cannabis. Then we'll go to the not so positive. 1940s, Hemp for Victory campaign starts. The US government encourages hemp farming again. 1944, medical research says that Cannabis is safe. 1950s and 60s, there's the Cultural Revolution of recreational cannabis. 1976, Randall versus the US. Robert Randall used cannabis for his glaucoma. He was, I believe, jailed. This case made medical use possible. 1980s, 1990s, you have the LGBTQ plus community using cannabis as a treatment for HIV. They set up buyers clubs. And if you look back at some of our postings, you could look back at this whole talk we did on the LGBT community and cannabis. And we go into a lot of the history of how the LGBT community and trans folks actually helped bring legalization. So 1996, we get California legalizing medical use. 2012 is recreational in Colorado. 2015, more medical cannabis research grows. 2018, hemp is made legal everywhere, as well as CBD and other derivatives. And then today, 37 states have a legal cannabis program. So what is the history of prohibition? This is where things take a really kind of ugly turn. So we have that Catholic Church. They're kind of the first ones who start this negative spin. Cannabis is bad. It's making women want to have autonomy, and they're becoming free-thinking people, so couldn't have that. So there's a lot of execution, witch burnings, so on and so forth. 1500s, the Ottoman Empire actually bans cannabis use and coffee. The king and the royalty felt like it was making the people have too many free thoughts, and again, that was bad for the monarchy. 1877, and feel free, panel, to chime in. One of my mentors who couldn't be here today talks about a lot about how post-Civil War Reconstruction was one of the most massive overturning of wealth in the United States. There was a real chance for equity and equality for everyone post-Civil War. But of course, anytime, as we see today, anytime we see everyone having more equity and a better shot at life, there's always that really aggressive pushback. So in 1877 to 1950, we see Jim Crow laws. Cannabis fines and punishment start looking very different for people who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, Latinx. All of those communities really suffer starting in 1877, and then progressively getting, different variations of horrible from that point on. 1910, the Mexican Revolution happens, and there's a large flux of immigration from Mexico. At the same time, though, there's a little bit of classism because Mexico actually was also outlawing cannabis at the same time. There's also a large influx of immigrants, Asian immigrants, Indian immigrants as well. And so there's a lot of racism towards people, and Native Americans are also negatively affected here, as well as the Black community. So in 1931, things really start to crack down. 29 states ban cannabis. In 1930, this real monster, Harry Anslinger, gets appointed. He is a nephew-in-law of Andrew Mellon, so nepotism at his finest. And he's actually in a couple of, if you've seen the Oscar award-winning film about Billie Holiday, he really tortured her. So as we see, cannabis prohibition comes from a couple of places: anti-immigrant sentiment, racism, as well as folks trying to make money, as well as Billie Holiday was very famous for singing the song Strange Fruit, which was inspiring some social change. The people in charge did not like that. So they were trying to solve a lot of problems at once by prohibition. So in 1937, prohibition again begins under the Stamp Tax Act. There was no tax actually ever placed on stamps, ever. They just banned cannabis. 1930s to 1960s, you have the Red Scare and McCarthyism. This is where drug testing for cannabis begins, and loyalty to your employer. A lot less about if you're using cannabis on Saturday for a Monday job, a lot more about how loyal you are. 1960s and 1970s, we have Richard Nixon, who uses prohibition to jail groups of people he didn't like. He famously says, multiple reports come out throughout the United States saying cannabis is safe, cannabis is safe, cannabis is safe. He uses this, he's famous for saying horrible things like, why would I make that legal when it puts people in jail that I don't like? 1980s, it gets even worse with Ronald and Nancy Reagan. The official war on drugs begins in 1986. 1986 to modern era. This gets a little bit better in 2017. The mandatory minimum start and the 3-strike rule. This had devastating effects throughout the country and even world, because we see places like the Philippines following our suit in the war on drugs and murdering people for low-level drug crimes. But a lot of those nations were basing their policy off of US policy. And present day incarcerations and arrests still disproportionately affect BIPOC communities, even in legal states. So even in Illinois, I have a lot of maps that we could refer back to, but even in legal states, Illinois is legal recreationally and medically. DC, Simona's from DC, they are legal recreationally as well as medically. They won't even post their statistics on the disproportionate arrests related to cannabis. So this is still a really big problem, even in legalization. I just have some horrific things that people share. DARE was known to be ineffective and based on nonsense. As you see, Reagan aide literally said that cannabis can make you gay, and there's so many things backwards about that statement that I can't even begin to unpack. And actually, there's a lot more things out on the internet, but some of them were so horrific and just racist that I didn't even want to reshare them, but just lots of things. I'm going to skip past this clip for now, but we can come back to this. So Ronald Reagan literally says that he says marijuana is the most dangerous drug, and it's going to ruin everything. He was talking out of his butt. And then if we remember the 90s, This Is Your Brain on Drugs, Partnership for a Drug-Free Alliance. They seem like they have our best interest at heart. No, they were very much a part of the mandatory minimums as well as these really backwards laws. And look who a Partnership for a Drug-Free Alliance is. I just like to call attention to this. DuPont Chemicals, there they are again. Interesting that alcohol and tobacco companies and pharmaceuticals are part of this alliance. And then before we get to just the discussion, here are some maps. So this map in purple, it's really interesting to compare these maps. This is how much cannabis is used throughout the United States based on demographic areas. And some examples is focus here on Cook County, and you focus here in Arizona. And then over here we have LA County, and you see these like more cannabis use. If we focus on where people are using cannabis and then where poverty is, we see a little bit of a correlation there. But here's where things get very strange. So again, we have these counties here in Arizona. And so some of these counties are where, particularly what struck me is you see the cannabis use, you see incarceration rates, and you see a matching of where people have food insecurity. And then you also see a matching of where do Black, Indigenous, Latinx, people of color, where do they live? And there's a strong correlation between all of these maps and who is affected negatively and why. And we're going to deep dive into this. So because a few of us are based in Chicago, Cook County, which has decriminalized, which has recreational and medical legal cannabis, we are expunging records. Still, there are Black people who are arrested 10 times more than white people for cannabis-related crimes. And this could be for driving because there's a scent. This could be being over your purchase limit, a wide public use of cannabis. Like the crimes related are very minor and they are ridiculous. So this is still very, very much a problem. And then just to show a map, here's the disproportionately impacted areas of Illinois. As you see Chicago, you see the South Side and West Side don't have dispensaries, are not really part of, we're still working on equity licenses in Illinois, but there's really no dispensaries in certain parts of Chicago, which disproportionately matches. I actually use the homicide rate because we cannot talk about, everything is related, right? So you see areas where people are being incarcerated. Cook County Jail is one of the largest jails in the country. There are lots of people there on nonviolent drug crimes, and of course, how do people make money, and how is that related to the homicide rate? It all connects, but you see the same neighborhoods being disproportionately affected, where we have poverty, we have crime. The federal poverty level, again, we see the South and West sides being affected. That's not supposed to come yet. But I wanted to briefly like clip through those maps to show that just how it's all interconnected and bad and backwards. So I want to talk about the problems and then what to do next and how to fix them. So
I want to correct one thing you said.
Yeah.
And I want to clarify that where we have crime, but there's crime everywhere. And so what maps is a disproportionate amount of activities that happen everywhere. You see with why that rate of incarceration happens. It's not that pot or and do now considered not legal. So there's more policing in those you're talking about.
Yes. I completely agree. Yeah. And so thank you, Cassandra. Yeah. And I am somebody, and I think we all can agree that crime absolutely happens everywhere. And yeah, there's just the laws and where there's over policing in the school to prison. I kind of, in some of our notes in the emails, I talked about the school to prison pipeline. There's this very disproportional, where crime is being reported, where there's overfunding of policing and more of an abuse of power. Yeah, there's a great TikTok by a creator that talks about how there's a lot of focusing again on Illinois. There's a lot of people crab-appling about, oh, Chicago's so violent, and the creators like, hey, Rockford, DeKalb County, these places, DeKalb County. There's other Sangamon County, places outside of Chicago. I'm trying to the Quad Cities. Oh, I can take off my shared screen. Yeah. So thanks.
And it's kind of like you were saying, Rebecca. I mean, a little while ago during the slides, a lot of where we are today, where we are today is absolutely, because of the systemic, oppression, to Black and brown communities and people. So it's not at all by chance that when we look at, the communities that have food insecurity, when we look at the communities that are less resourced kind of across board, no matter what life domain we're talking about, they're oftentimes, communities of color, because you have the individuals who not only have we had this like smear campaign of cannabis and of different practices being bad or wrong or unhealthy, but we've also had people in positions of power who've been able to really come into the practice of whatever it is they're doing, whether it's police or whether it's in the judicial system, who take on their biases, their racist beliefs, and that's how we end up with this disproportionate, rate of incarceration, disproportionate rate of arrests, disproportionate rate of even individuals who've been involved in the CJ system, right? And so when we think about the impact, it's not just, the conviction of a person with a cannabis charge that, has ruined lives and generations. But in some instances, it's just the mere fact of being involved in the CJ system. Maybe I was arrested. Maybe there was use of cannabis, and that was deemed, wrong in a particular place because I live in and I'm really just throwing out scenarios in a federal housing community. And that's important to point out because in DC, because it is federal land, and because it's not a state. So when you said a bit ago, DC, we're close to being recreationally, having recreational cannabis cut on, but not yet, right? Because there are so many additional barriers that we face in DC by not having statehood. So it's all these
That's right.
intricacies, right, of still oppression, even with that, right? And people say we're close to it because, just what, a month or two, the ability to self-certify, was cut on, which is amazing, right? So people no longer have that barrier to access, but still, nonetheless, if you are in different, housing situations, if you've had any interaction with the CJ system, like there are just certain still things you can't do. And as it relates to use, where you can still end up in a pretty bad situation, and arrests are still happening in DC for cannabis use. So I did want to kind of just point that out and really applaud you for giving that history of cannabis in such a short amount of time, because you're right. How do you chronicleize or put in summary that much history when it comes to cannabis? Because a lot of this is, mind shifts that we have to have as it relates to cannabis, and being more unafraid to have conversation around, where we need to pivot, right? When we look at cannabis use, when we look at cannabis policy, because it is a more situation of like re-legalization than just, legalization, right? And when you think about it from that aspect, and we know this plant isn't new, and it's like indigenous, and a lot of us have had like years, right, of interaction with this plant, we have to again just double down on like, okay, this is what has happened, and really get a good sense of what that looks like in real terms, and not just statistics, but the statistics are important. And I love that you had all those maps kind of overlaying the compounded issues within our communities. That's important to talk about and see.
Yeah. One of the things that brought me to this and my entire like origin story, like how did I get to nursing? How did I get to cannabis? How did I even get involved with public policy? That's where actually me and Cassandra met years and years ago. It was a clinical rotation at Cook County Jail, and that was the most radicalizing, eye-opening experience I've ever had in my entire life. 90% of the folks there didn't do anything different than anybody else I knew. The only difference was over policing in their neighborhood. They were all there. Most of the women I talked to, nonviolent, low level. I had cannabis on me, and that was just, like I still. So that entire 6-week clinical changed the course of my life forever. And it's really, it's, yeah. And
we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to think about it, but mass incarceration, like it's heavy when you see it on a consistent basis. You're absolutely right. And I could just relate to that from the little time that I worked in a minimum security prison in North Carolina. And it's a lot to see when you realize, okay, it's real. Again, it's not just stats, and it's not just graphs depicting the problem, but these are real folks with real families and communities that have been broken. So
yeah,
it's definitely heavy and important.
You look, we call $1 million blocks. So these are blocks. Millions of dollars has been invested in policing, millions of dollars invested in criminalization of those $1 million blocks. All the systemic issues, food insecurity, those blocks and those blocks are the neighborhoods where the food would, and how the Whole Foods our city spent how much in our tax dollars to Englewood. The reason it was because first it was a place where and over policing was a predominantly most of the people who were incarcerated were arrested for drug charges, and in Cook County Jail for a long time. So we talk about the policies that are impacting what we see now as the attempt to turn around from the war on drugs. Just bring the grocery stores in, but things that abolishes cash bail. That's people sit in jail, losing their jobs, their family, on a charge that, and more often than not, is some charge, and for people typically because they don't have the money to bond them, absurd, and part of the problem that in our last election cycle that was the purge, and what is happening to Illinois, and what's going to eat and stay with their families and their resources towards fighting that they've been impacted by.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think both of you can talk about this. Something that I learned I was on a school board for 2 years, and something that I feel like, and I think, Cassandra, you could definitely answer this, and Simona, you can too. I kind of saw, even there is a direct, school to prison pipeline with SROs related to, again, like low-level cannabis use. Kids who are vaping in school get sent to court when there are many dispensaries and vape shops everywhere. And yeah, could you talk more about that? Because that's just another, and what happens when folks get into that system, even if you are in jail, even when you're not charged with a crime yet. Yeah,
it follows you, right? I'm sorry, Cassandra, I didn't even cut you off.
Say we know that schools that are much more likely to have some imprisoned, and it can be for many other things, but we also know that there are a lot of seeing what's happening with school shooting, putting policing into mechanism of protection, but high school. I grew up on the poor parts of the North Shore, and poor parts, I really just mean it's the black and brown. And so when we would go to the rich, wealthy parts, they used way more drugs than anybody encountered in high school was using. Mm-hmm. They had minds about it, like they're driving Beamers to school. They had all kinds of drugs. And what we saw was that, like the policing in our school being arrested, the policing in their school being, put in rehab programs, how to help little Jimmy or Johnny. That idea that that road does increase the likelihood of creation, but it does, just like everything in black and brown communities, little to do with what the charge is. The same thing. All high schoolers are using drugs. I'm Memorial. I remember going to a friend's high school friends, and all they talk to year old men getting back together again around their drug use in the 70s, and like things they did as a result were. That is teenage, modern times, and probably all the way back to like that. This is part of what that teenage period is like. It's and doing all those things. So SROs just remind us, and the behaviors that aren't going to be accepted by our system.
And I think if I'm hearing you right too, Cassandra, like and this is like I'm trying to not working directly in the CJ world anymore, there are certain, buzzwords, and I feel like it always changes. But when um, we often would talk about just like the mischaracterization, right, of Black and Brown people. And when we talk about it, even in a non like work setting, or even not academia, even from parent to child, we often have to think about it from this angle too, like preparing our own kids, right, to realize that, when you walk out that door, you're going to be perceived differently and handled differently, and the approach will be different, right? So when you talked about the intervention of, what resources, are allotted in school systems that tend to have like more individuals of wealth or of a different, socioeconomic, class, that's relatable, because, when it comes to Black and Brown children, it's, we don't want to talk about it as much. And that's why I love quoting Angela Davis when she talks about mass incarceration, because it's so easy to forget about the connection. It's so easy to forget that a lot of where we are again is through systemic oppression, and it is through the mischaracterization of Black and Brown people that we've been just targeted, right? Just targeted from so many different angles. So again, your story share, Rebecca, about the vaping and school systems, and just how, that one small thing, can mount up to something much bigger and create so many barriers in that child's life, because that's overkill, right? That's applying, um, you know, it's applying a much heavier hand, right, in terms of the consequence than it really than what should, right? Because we all know kids explore. I mean, I'm just being kids explore, and again, to your point, Cassandra, like I think back, my parents telling me, their experiences when they were kids. Whew, what didn't they try? And I'm saying that lightly, but it's really kind of true. Um, but they weren't at that point. We weren't at that point as a society where we were being overly jailed necessarily, for use. And I think that's important for us to, like, again, keep in mind that a lot of these are like new interventions, new systemic ways to put folks in these very compromising situations, where sometimes, they're just being people, and they're just, exploring, or they're just, you know um or maybe it's a need, right, for plant use, right? And we don't want to talk about that enough, right? So it's so many complexities, and there are so many, I think, nuances to kind of where we are, and that correlation between cannabis use and different social determinants of health, or really between over criminalization or cannabis prohibition and its impact on our communities and our people, that we could talk about this for days.
Yeah. And I kind of wonder if we should do a second one of these too, because there's there's so much to talk about where I can't even like think of like which question to ask next. Because um, with social determinants of health, and we've all read the studies, um, I know on the three of us, they impact health more than really anything else. Um, and nobody addresses them, right? Because when we're incarcerating people, when we are forcing people to live in poverty, it's, it's not, there's a lot of people are trying very, very hard to keep pushing individual responsibility on people. And it's just not true. How do you not, if you have been incarcerated for cannabis and then you go to get a job, but you've been incarcerated, or let's say you haven't been incarcerated at all, but you get a job and you use cannabis, which is legal, or just CBD, which is federally legal. If you test positive on that drug test, and let's face it, the people who are getting drug tested are working people. It is not, it is not the C-suite. It is not the executives. It is working people. It's nurses, it's teachers. Who are nurses and teachers? There's a lot more diversity in nursing and teaching, service work. and then, you know, you used cannabis at 30 days ago at a concert, you test positive, then it's difficult to get a job. Sometimes your license is reported. A nurse out of Louisiana was using cannabis. She got her license taken. If you are a Black nurse or a Latinx nurse, you have a much higher chance of getting your nursing license taken from you for really nothing. That puts people in the cycle of poverty. And how can you avoid diabetes type 2 when there's no access to a grocery store? Getting to a grocery store is expensive because the trains don't run on time in most cities. There's a lack of infrastructure.
It's compounded.
So like, that's why we should have another one of these, because like it starts as one thing and it seems intentional, right? Because
it is
the defunding of public health, like, yeah,
100%. And that's the thing, when we say war on people, right? There are some of us who affectionately, you know, have started many years ago, right? At this point, instead of saying war on drugs, it was a war on people, because it wasn't just the people who are behind bars, right? This impacted, it literally is everyone, right? Because that's somebody's auntie potentially that has been incarcerated, that's somebody's cousin who was arrested for use and now has a strike against them, right? And you already have the multiple strikes of either being a minority or your sexuality. Like, there are so many again, just kind of, you know, again, domino effects that this has. You can't not see it as a war on people when you look around, to your point, and there's only 2 grocery stores. And you know, it's really funny because yesterday I got a chance to meet the owner of our fresh food market here in DC. And one of the things she was saying is that she tried so hard to get like funding to create this kind of co-op where there is fresh food accessible, that's like ethnically, you know, appropriate and that's affordable. But oftentimes, you know, when we have conversations about putting resources into a community that has been targeted, those resources don't always come readily, right? And we definitely don't have, meaning minority folks, don't have access to necessarily develop those systems, to develop those types of grocery stores with fresh food, because we've been through literally a war, right? The community doesn't have the ability to sometimes rebuild back better until there's interest back into the community, right? Either from developers or from, you know, folks in the city plan. Like, there has to be this interest, and the G word that we all sometimes cringe and still talking about, but gentrification. Like, it's all related. And when we think about it from that angle of like communities being built back better, right? During gentrification, we have to acknowledge like everybody has a collective role. And I think that's kind of what one of the things I heard you say a little bit ago, Rebecca, just in terms of like, it's not an individual charge that we're while we're having this conversation, while we work in the industry. It is because we understand and know that we have to collectively mount up, so to speak. We have to collectively be in conversation and in action to build back better, right? From the war on people.
And you said something that I want to have Cassandra comment on before she leaves, because you said something really interesting about gentrification. And I'm just 2 unfun facts about Chicago. So in the South Loop, there is a fantastic school. And there's this, Cassandra can explain this much better than I can. So the South Loop has essentially gentrified over the last, I don't know, 10, 20 years. Fantastic, award-winning Black high school, I believe, is there. Also at the same
an
time,
elementary school.
It's an elementary school that I'll let Cassandra talk about, because she could talk more about it. But at the same time, so she'll explain the school, but also at the same time, the residents of the South Loop, the same alliance, is also fighting against a Black-owned dispensary in the same neighborhood. So go on, Cassandra. Tell us everything about that.
There's a National Teachers Academy. It is a school, and it is a site actually walked the public housing, the school. Many of the students lived in that high rise. They watched those high rises become racist public housing closures daily and manual administration. Students watched, the generational homes for and still work to school every day, right there, right now, create community and main unity through their school, even though they were housing. And the school's been, which is the highest rating in Chicago school systems, now. It's been a 1 or a 1. That school is an incredible few predominantly plus schools in Chicago, because level 1, that 1 plus, those ratings are more correlated to whiteness than they are to anything else. Level 1 plus school that is not predominantly white, not have a predominantly white and wealthy school. So we know in Chicago that those and the South Loop community, so they have done to make sure that policy in a high school, including housing, land, build a South Loop High School, National Teachers Academy, and they turned into a high school for them, while simultaneously not acknowledging the Loop was a Black community, 10 years ago. So everything they can to have to go to school with Black kids. They don't in the area to be their high schools, trying to keep them marijuana, but being a Black-owned marijuana dispensary.
Yeah. So I just read that this morning where they were pushing back hard, and I was like, man, like just like you said, Cassandra, like nothing seems, it's like very obvious what is happening. It's gross. I don't have another word for it. What I like also that we talked about ending cash bail in Illinois, and that was like a big, and I don't know if DC is, I know DC, because of that intersection of like not quite a state, like.
Yeah. We still literally are fighting like kind of on an individual basis, because there are groups like the DMV or Black Mama Bailout.
Yeah.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's a national group, and we have definitely chapters here in DC led by some amazing Black female abolitionists who are definitely boots on the ground, consistently engaging folks to be in protest and be in advocacy to really make sure that moms in particular are able to be bailed out. Because, like, to your example a little bit ago, I remember participating in one of those demonstrations outside of the jail system, and a mom had been arrested and had been in jail for about a week over like stealing, I think it was like 2 candy bars or something, and she just didn't have enough cash to get out. But we made sure that she was released just before Mother's Day this year. So those types of things absolutely are still happening. And I know, again, there are people who make it their mission to consistently do the groundwork to fight for folks, so they aren't just left in a cage for no good reason.
Yeah. Cassandra had to drop off because she had to get back to work, and I'm so grateful that she was
Oh.
able to make it. And I apologize for the technical difficulties. I literally think that there's like a sunstorm sometimes that makes like the connection like wild and the sound. I have no idea. It's something in the satellite. So I would love, we could keep going for a couple of minutes. I don't have anywhere to be until 1. But we can keep going for a couple of minutes because I know we got a little bit of a late start. Yeah, I love, what else? And I have Bonnie, if she was supposed to come on, but if Bonnie, if you're still there, feel free to post a link. So obviously mutual aid is a good way to give back to the community. There's, fridges and communities, essentially, people just give cash to their neighbors. Like, here's food, here's cash, no strings attached. There's no grants, there's no writing anything. That's one way. I'll have Bonnie, if she's still there in the comments, to write how folks can donate to the food pantry, but also even beyond that, before we even get to people needing food and assistance for basic needs, how else, what else can we do to kind of stop this, particularly the disproportionate, especially in legal markets? That's what really still bothers me, is just the disproportional arrest rate for nonsense. Like yeah. What can we do? How can we donate to your organization? What can we do to make things better?
I feel like, so again, like there's like the individual level, right? And then there's like the collective level, right? I feel like there are distinctly, of course, organizations who do this, again, the work on a daily basis to help folks as they're exiting the prison system, to make sure that they are able to kind of meet their day-to-day needs, right? Because what we know, and I feel like the stat last time I read an article about this, it was like something like 70% of all folks released upon release are at a place of food insecurity, right? Because they don't leave with having resources, right? And oftentimes there isn't a wraparound type of service kind of put in place. So connecting to organizations that do that work, I feel like, is super important. And then also, we all, and I say this kind of lightly, but we all know someone or like for that could benefit, right, from our help, right, individually, whether it's helping them connect to a case manager, like we know someone who's been recently released, or organizations like 40 Tons brand. They even have a Can of Christmas event coming up this Saturday in LA, where they're pouring love and resources into families who've been impacted by prohibition. So I think getting involved in that way, volunteering, donating, right, resources as it relates to food, or again, workforce development skills, right? So someone can have the means to provide, food for their family and for themselves. And I also feel like a big part of it is to our knowledge base. I think we all need to do, and including myself, I try to educate myself on a pretty consistent basis, okay, on like what are the impacts, of prohibition, and how can we make sure to keep these conversations going. So in some ways, especially when I'm around new people, I love wearing my Marijuana Matters shirt,
Yes.
because it's something simple, but it really does get the conversation going in terms of really driving home, impact, even the intentionality of the organization being called Marijuana Matters, right? So it's a statement, but it's also like it is the organization name, and that was very much done intentionally. And if folks know the history around, the word use of the word marijuana, you know that it's important that we reclaim our power, right? And really do some reverse engineering when it comes to the smear on cannabis and on the plant. So being in conversation, being connected to organizations that are doing the work, I think is super important, because we're definitely at this point where more and more people, I feel like, are wanting to be a part of like the action, the movement, the legislative process, to say, okay, how can we make sure that this is something, when I say something, that the oppressive practices and policies that are in place, how can we help to reverse engineer some of those wrongdoings. So I feel like, yes, if you would like to be connected to Marijuana Matters, we would love to connect. Our way of showing up is definitely to provide education to help folks, again, become advocates, more than just consumers, especially talking to Black and brown folks, or anyone in general, because you can get the latest Zaza or smoke whatever, but you can also tap into a conversation about social equity, because that's just as important, because social equity doesn't just apply to the business owners and those in the industry, right? It applies to the communities that were impacted, right? It applies to patients. It applies really to everyone, because social equity is bigger than even just cannabis, right? It's making sure that we all have the appropriate resources and access points, right, to live meaningful and have good quality of life. So definitely tap into us, marijuanamatters.org. And we're pretty active on our Instagram. So definitely want to kind of elevate that. So folks can tap in. Marijuana Matters DC is the Instagram handle. And we do put up, again, different content posts to really, again, get conversation going and make sure that this is something that's on the forefront of our minds as consumers, as government, as just regular old community folk. So I appreciate you, Rebecca, for having me.
Oh my gosh. No, I'm so happy you made it. Because this, it keeps me like, it's one of the things that like really keeps me up at night. I don't know. I've talked about this at like networking events or parties to people in the industry. Like, I wonder, I'm interested to ask somebody, I am, but I'm also don't want to ask because I don't want to like re-traumatize them, because I'm sure there's a lot of bad feelings, rightfully so. But like, I can't imagine being in prison right now and seeing everyone and their uncle like out at consuming events, like seeing this legal market happening, and like you're in prison for the same thing. Like and so like sometimes even just at the dispensary, I'll hear somebody say something like, "Oh, this is like the Apple store," and I'm thinking like, well, who built this industry? Like who did we all, Yeah.
Can't lose focus on that. We can't, even if it's to your point about re-traumatizing. I feel you. You don't want to do that, but I know for where we are right now, we need more folks who are willing to use their voice in such a strategic way to tell their story, to be the driver of their own narrative, so we can get it, and get it a bit faster. Because again, there are so many folks that we know engage, right, in cannabis use. So it's important that we also try to make sure that we're pulling them into the conversation and making sure that we are all working and striving toward that community that is rebuilt better, right? Rebuilt back better. And I think that's important because we've been through a lot. But there's still, greener pastures. There's still opportunities, right, that exist as it relates to how our community looks and how it feels, and the different resources that we have, so long as we're collectively moving toward progress.
Something, and of course, like I haven't discussed it on LinkedIn because I feel like a lot of people commented. I know you probably saw it too on Instagram, LinkedIn, but we'll mention Shirtgate. So there is a wonderful person who created a line of clothing and canvas bags to encourage people to buy cannabis from Black owned and women Black owned cannabis companies, and buy weed from women. You've probably seen it. It's Curaleaf. Please purchase these bags. Do that for sure. Buy that. And there were some bucket heads, and that's the most polite way I can say it. I saw them, and I like it.
Oh, you say you saw them?
Saw them, and I cringed hard. I was like, oh goodness, like I just didn't get near. I can't. I have no filter when it comes to folks like that.
Rightfully so.
Don't know. If you don't know what Shirtgate is, just go on LinkedIn, put in cannabis Shirtgate, you'll figure it out. But do that. Do buy weed from women, buy that merch. And tying that in, Vic Mensa said something at a conference that I was at, and he called out the room. I clapped. If you are an investor and you're watching this, please, please, please try to fund real people, particularly Black and Brown people, particularly people who have been hurt by the war on drugs. Please fund them in a real way. There is DC I love, and Chicago, there are some really cool historic Black and Brown neighborhoods that absolutely could flourish with just a teensy bit of investment. It doesn't even take that. Like it, I mean, like just money. There's so many cool and historic things that can be done, and reinvestment to the community. And Vic Mensa said it, like, don't just say that you're for equity, like do it, like put your money there, like put folks in your leadership, build businesses. And so I think that's important. So purchase from those folks, like you said, there's plenty of places to buy cannabis, but
yeah. But let's do it in a way where we can be a bit more socially conscious, right? And this is something we talk about in our social equity toolkit all the time, is that there are so many ways we can again just use our dollar in a way that will benefit more than just ourselves. And I think if we have more, again, that collective mindset, we would see that even if there is a new company, and unfortunately I didn't get to get the whole gist of what Cassandra was sharing, just because of the tech issues around the school in Chicago or the area. But if I understood even just a little bit of it, or heard it properly, I would again say, another resource is when you look at our social equity toolkit, you'll kind of see some really good examples of just ways sometimes we can advocate and really have conversation around, tools, resources, different interventions we can ask for in our community. And as it relates again to the topic around food insecurity, you bet your bottom dollar, like in terms of like different types of businesses, cannabis businesses coming into the community, sometimes we need to negotiate and say, okay, well, you coming in, does that look like help, starting a co-op? Does it look like help getting that park or garden that our community desperately, kind of needs? Because there are certain communities, and thinking of my own, where I grew up, where there just aren't enough green spaces, aren't enough gardens, aren't enough opportunities to plant fresh food in our community. But we can again try to get some of those things and resources, and definitely holding the cannabis community and businesses accountable to make that happen. Government is important. So
yeah. Oh my gosh. No, thank you for sharing. And the connection is strong, because once it's really hard to recover from any sort of even misdemeanor, right? Even that on your record can really mess up licensing. As a CNA, that all, it's not hard to be food insecure. This is a dreary fact, but most of us are one paycheck away from complete poverty. It could happen to any of us at any time. So anything we can do to make people's lives a little bit easier, especially those who are disproportionately affected by these systemic war on people, because I think that's exactly what it is.
Then we need to do that.
We need to do it. We just need to do it. And it's long overdue. And there's a lot of good content out there on TikTok that I'm surprised, and Instagram that I'm surprised makes it out. But it talks about how policies that are based in racism, let's say that you're just not an ethical or good person, and you love hate, like you are a tribal person. being racist ruins things for everyone. Like, there was a creator that talked about public parks and public pools. Why did we take these things away? Like in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, we had public pools, we had public parks, we had more green spaces, right? Cities were invested in, even though there were lots of working people, and like what happened in the 70s and 80s. And essentially, like the loud racist people ruined it for everyone. They were like, we don't want to go to the same places with diverse people. And so you see the shutting down of public pools, of public parks, of public green spaces, of grocery stores. So
The
racism,
divestment was strategic.
yep, it was strategic, yeah, and it hurt, it hurt everyone. Like, you know, like we should have public spaces. We should have green spaces. Like, I just, it boggles my mind. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, anyone with like a sense of ethics and any sort of feels about not, and being very careful with my words because I want to be sure I'm drawing people in and not propelling them away, you know. Um,
No, you're right though.
yeah,
Checking our bias is important. Checking our bias.
yeah,
And again, everybody, I don't think you wake up and become necessarily, unless it's in you, right, unless it's in you, meaning you grew up in a way where you always kind of did something and always were active in some type of political or civic kind of project in your community. I don't think it necessarily comes inherently, right? I think we need to sometimes take a step back and really again check our privilege. What can we do? Check our bias. How are we thinking, right, about again, the societal structures that have been at play, and divesting in our community. Cannabis prohibition was a way to do that, right? To divest in communities of color who were very much vulnerable, right? And very much marginalized communities. So I think you are spot on to like just encourage people if they're listening to this to do some soul searching. You don't wake up, an ally. I don't think you wake up,
right,
necessarily free of those things. But I'm appreciative that at my age that I can genuinely say that I do see like pretty wide strides in terms of like folks really wanting to do better, really wanting to be a part of more collective efforts to make
yeah,
improvement in our communities and have ownership, no matter what that looks like, right?
yeah,
Because ownership can be an array of options, not just in one particular segment of the cannabis ecosystem and just not in one particular domain of industry, even, right? Because, like, for instance, with me, I shared a bit ago, my background was like healthcare and mental health, and I was a CJ major. And it's like, well, how are all those things related? Every last one of those things that I've done in my career has been about serving marginalized communities, serving Black and Brown communities, and making sure that when it comes to resources, that we are, continuously fighting for that, continuously
yeah,
fighting for the same access, right, and the same ability to have
yeah,
good quality of life. And you can't really do that when it comes to all these different social determinants of health. And well, at a point, SDOS was, I got tired of hearing about
yeah,
it because I was like, it's everything, right? It really is everything. And, we don't want to talk about that. And when we're like, oh, we're enabling folks, a patient can't get to the clinic because there's just like 3 buses, and she'll miss an opportunity for an interview if she goes to this appointment. And well, she really don't, there's so much pressure put on the family structure in terms of what should happen. But when you are living in constant vulnerability, right, to
yeah,
different elements, over policing, you know, under resourced community, it's not a wonder why, again, I'm having to make these decisions about my livelihood. Oh well, I'll sell marijuana. You know what I mean? Like that'll
yeah,
take care of my family. And that sounds I think to some like the easy route, but those are choices usually out of like economic strain. A lot of That's the reality.
oh, Yeah. There was a really interesting piece on NPR not that long ago. They talked to somebody from the south side of Chicago who was incarcerated, and I can't remember why. But he was like, they were like, what would get you to like stop doing XYZ? And I can't remember if it was cannabis related or I don't think it was. I think it started there and then evolved. And he said, he was like, if I got a job that paid a living wage, like I wouldn't need any of this. And that's really it. I completely agree. We can't, how do we have healthy people when we're forcing, sure, everybody has a choice if we want to work or who we want to work for, but not really. You have the choice not to work, but then you die. So it's this kind of very forced thing.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
you definitely are. The cards are dope. Oh, away.
Yeah, and I mean, if you've never been poor or precarious, even precarious, I don't. Yeah, if my choice was not eating at all and doing anything else, I would definitely do anything else because nobody is going to starve. And yeah, the barriers we put on people, the oh, there's no food in your community. Why do you have diabetes? Why do you have high blood pressure?
Mhm,
You need to
mhm.
stop eating those snacks. Like, where are people gonna go? Like the only like, I mean, and this is we see it in Chicago, we see it in DC, we see it throughout the country. If you live in a poor community, you are more likely to have a bodega, probably not with any fresh fruit, probably not with any fresh vegetables, maybe a fast food place, maybe. And that's kind of it. And then how are you supposed to take most people living in economic precarity? There's not they have more than one job. How are you supposed to work two jobs, support your family, take care of your children, and do a 2-hour commute to the grocery store?
That part. And let's add on, again, maybe cannabis is helping me with my anxiety or my pain. And I have different, obligations to the government. Maybe I'm receiving SNAP benefits. And again, how do those two things interact? Usually, especially again, if you're in DC, they don't, because it's still federally illegal, and that would still raise a red flag. That would still cause issue if you are caught, right,
Yep.
consuming. So it's just, well, it definitely is a lot of having. I feel like it's always like a matrix effect, right, in
Yeah.
communities that have been targeted, because you really have to pick that red pill or blue. Often that's a consistent choice that you're having to make, and that stress level it's crazy. And I remember, being a student in CJ studying like criminology, and we were having conversations about the body's impact, like what happens when you are pulled over by a cop, especially what often happens if you are black or brown being pulled over a cop. Your body literally, goes into high alert, most of us, right? And you go into that fight or flight, and your blood pressure is
Yeah.
elevated. So in terms, again, your health, sometimes consumption is not about, oh, let's just get high, no, it's very
Yep.
much about like, how can I have a healthier life? How can I, feel better in a way that is more restorative,
Yeah.
to my body, and to my lifestyle, as opposed to some of the pharmaceutical, options that are on the market. So yeah, it's a lot.
There's so much. And exactly that. So yeah, and using cannabis as pain relief, using cannabis as an anxiety relief, it's affordable. It's accessible now. It's a little more accessible. So yeah, and with the drug testing, the drug testing piece really grills my cheese, because it makes me so mad that we have a legal market, yet we are still drug testing people for jobs, and it's mostly anything be anything that is not a high end executive,
Yep,
um,
yep.
drug
That
testing. Like,
isn't bias. That's bias at its finest. I mean, the NBA, what are they? They're on year 3, not testing, I believe, for
yeah,
players this off season. And I
yeah,
mean, that says magnitudes within its within itself. But if I'm if I work for sanitation, the city doing sanitation, I'm tested. I mean, just make it make sense. And often,
Exactly.
those practices and policies just don't make sense. But what it does do again is often put more strain on folks who are already on the edge. And that's where we need to, like, again, realize those things are happening and really advocate and really get in more involved politically to make changes, so that way this type of system, is stopped in its tracks, right? And we try to do no more harm than what has already been done.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I'm happy. I would love to have this conversation again if you're free
Yeah,
anytime
just let
within
me
the
know.
next couple months. Because so topics we didn't cover, and we only, honestly, if you're listening, I feel like, I think you'd agree, we only kind of covered like the cliff notes of a lot of these things, which is
Yes.
probably, I'm usually more like, I'm usually like a much more fast talker. And this is a topic where it's so important. I didn't want to misspeak, but also there's so many layers to it where it's like,
Lots to unpack.
where
Yeah,
do you even begin in like an hour? So we could like make this a whole series, because
absolutely.
there's the farming aspect, like oh no, hack on LinkedIn.
Oof.
No, no.
That has happened to me before. Yes. Kick them.
All right. I don't
Look,
know how to do.
horrible.
I'm going to turn off the
That
chat,
should
not
be
because I
there.
don't love the people out there, but oh God, sorry. Um,
Horrible.
Man. But yeah, there's the farming aspect. Like, how do we have our food system? How is our food
Mhm.
system affordable? And it's from migrant labor from Central and Central America because of the war on drugs and the underground market. There's a cartel, but it's not how we think it is. And that's why we're getting this influx of migrants who are working in horrible conditions to give us food that most of us can't even afford. And just the
Mhm.
prison industrial complex. Like, so there's about 1,000 things. So
There is. It's so many layers.
the
It is a
school
lot
dismissal
to unpack. So
pipeline.
yeah, you let me know whenever. Happy to rejoin to have more conversation around this, because it is a lot to unpack.
And so we'll post all of Marijuana Matters DC. We will post all of their links in our social media. Please donate to them if you can. Use their social equity packet if you are new to this. Other resources, easy to find. The movie 13 on Netflix is a really great discussion on the prison industrial complex and who that affects and why. The New Jim Crow is an excellent, excellent book on this. I would definitely read that as well. And also, your local library is an excellent source. There are lots of academic materials, but then easy to read materials about the history of all of these things. But yes, donate. And then if you want to help directly help people in the holidays, the Chicago Food Depository is a great place to donate if you are in the Midwest. If the Niles Township Food Pantry, where Bonnie was from, we have a lot of refugees in our community, one of the biggest suburban food pantries in the country. Donate there. So donate to food. And then if sometimes the nonprofit industrial complex, if you want your dollars to absolutely go to people, mutual aid, it's easy. Literally handing people money is one of the most effective ways to get people out of poverty, and studies have proved this. So if you know anybody who's struggling, literally just give them $100. It will have much more of an impact than a lot of things that you could do, and just say no worries, good. So that was our talk today. There's about a billion more things we can talk about. Simona, thank you so much. I absolutely love your organization.
Likewise.
Yeah, 40
Thank
Tons
you.
too. Thank you for mentioning 40 Tons is another really great organization to donate
Absolutely.
to. And thanks again for Curely, Fruited and Good. I have to say, what I love about this program the very most is not only the ability to educate people, but the connections and these really cool organizations that
Absolutely.
there's like so much more awareness. The coolest people I've met through this program. I love your organization so much. 40 Tons, Women Grow, Pulse. Like It's
It's
just
a
like
great
cool to be in the room with you guys.
it is. It's a really great cohort, and everybody is, really chomping away, right? At, the work. And the work kind of never stops, but that's kind of the cool part about where we are. I think in the ecosystem and how it's being built is that we get to have these conversations and again try to hold the powers that be accountable to really
Yeah.
make sure that equity, to make sure that is at the center, right, of everything. As we build and
Absolutely.
as we engage. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
This was great, great convo, Rebecca.
No, thank you for coming, and thank you, everyone. We're gonna put this on social media. The recording, it will be available later on YouTube and Facebook and TikTok, all the places. And we'll do this again because I know we only like you scratched the surface because this is so many stories and policies and things to talk about, history. So thank you again. Have a great day, everybody.
All right. Happy Friday.
Bye.